football clubs have this unique ability to connect to fans, and that builds value, and that builds interest. And that's why the Premier League is such a success, because it went out in 1992. It went to Mumbai, it went to Melbourne, it went to Mombasa, and it generated this global connection, which is the envy of every other big league. If it becomes predictable, if that jeopardy diminishes, if you take away the quality, then I think you'll lose the connection and the value could diminish.
Thanks for listening to the latest Beyond the Back Four podcast, available on YouTube and all podcast platforms. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single episode.
Welcome to a special episode of Beyond the Back Four. With us, Mark Clattenburg, our journalist pal Jack Gallagher, and Kieran Maguire, who likes to be referred to as a football finance guru, and rightly so, because that's exactly what he is. Now, on Friday, Premier League clubs gathered and voted for something new. I am not the person to explain that to you, but our football finance guru is. So, Kieran, can you begin this episode for us by explaining exactly what happened last week in what I assume were dark and shadowy rooms in sort of private members' clubs that no one could access?
Yes, the Premier League had a meeting of chief executives, and there were 3 votes being held, one of which the Premier League won convincingly, one of which squeaked through, and one of which was rejected. The one which everybody agreed on was very nerdy and very, very boring, so we'll park that. But I think the big issue that is going to impact the Premier League as far as next season and further on is concerned is that they are going to adopt the rules which are currently used by UEFA, and these are called Squad Cost rules. And the way that it works is that you take every £100 which is earned by the football club from ticket sales, from the TV deal, and from sponsorship, and also 1/3 of the profits that they make from player sales in the season. So you take that as your start number, and you can spend up to 85% of that on player wages and your head coach wages, transfer fees through what we call amortization. And the way that amortization works is that if I sign a player for 50 million quid on a 5-year contract, you say, well, that's a bit like renting a player for 10 million a year. Player write-downs. So if you sign somebody who's rubbish, and you have to write his value down, that and agents' fees, and because agents are they're the pantomime dames of football finance, because everybody hates football agents. Unnecessarily so, in my view, but that's a separate discussion. So that was voted for. 13 clubs voted in favour. 6 clubs voted against: Brentford, Brighton, Palace, Leeds, Fulham, and Bournemouth. And there was 1 abstention. So that was just enough, because you needed a 2/3 majority. It was just enough to get through. And that's very unusual in the history of the Premier League. They're used to getting 20 20 clubs in alignment, but we seem to be very factionalized these days. The reason why the big clubs voted for it was that it helps them more, because they've got bigger stadiums, they play more matches in Europe, they finish higher up the table. So all of those, the Manchester teams, the Merseyside teams, the big London teams were in favour of that rule. And what was voted against was something called anchoring, and this is effectively a wage cap. And that was, I think, only 7 clubs voted for, 12 voted against that. So that was rejected. And the reason why it was rejected was, first of all, the big clubs, the Manchester clubs and Liverpool and so on, because it was a wage cap, which was going to apply to every single club in the Premier League. Well, Manchester United don't want an aspirational club such as Newcastle United to be able to go and pay as much wages as Manchester United. So Newcastle voted against, Manchester United voted for, and so on. Or sorry, the other way around. So if Manchester United build a new stadium, because the wage cap is only linked to broadcast income, if Manchester United build a new stadium and they're generating £150 million a year more in season ticket money and match ticket money, that would have been ignored. So that's why the big clubs were opposed to it. So that one hasn't gone through. The PFA were opposed to it because they are inherently opposed to wage caps. And there was also a threat by agents to oppose it as well. So I think those clubs thought, we've spent an absolute fortune on legal fees with the Manchester City 115 charges, the last thing we need is another set of long-winded and very expensive litigation, which is costing each club somewhere in the region of £5 million just for the Manchester City case alone.
Just very quickly, who abstained?
That I've not managed to find out. I'm trying to be nosy. I'll ask you and I'll send you a DM, because that's what young people listen to.
Now we're talking. Why would they not put their heads above the parapet?
Because they didn't want to be seen to be aligned, because football has fallen into factions as far as the Premier League is concerned. They don't want to be seen to be aligned with one particular group or another. So it has become a bit like gang warfare now in the Premier League, and somebody wants to be teacher's pet and not joining any of the gangs.
Mark, you've worked at the top of the industry. And obviously, even just as a Newcastle fan, you can hear how Newcastle are disadvantaged by the system, or at least in this case, that vote. Do you think the structure is sufficient? Do you think it's right that the clubs are the ones who vote on these decisions when there are enough of the clubs with power to keep voting to maintain that power?
The power's changing all the time. If you saw power maybe 10 years ago in the Premier League, and the Premier League are, let's not beat the bush. The Premier League is the clubs. The clubs are the controlling body. So they'll have to have the vote of 20 clubs. But what's changed massively, and when I was working in Nottingham Forest, for example, you saw the changes. There is a lot of American owners. And the more American owners that have came in, seem to be trying to control the way the Premier League is run. And you can see certain things. We all know the American setup, like the MLS. They buy a franchise. They don't want relegation. They don't want their asset to be damaged. And they're trying every way, the same, but in an English way, how to make sure we don't get relegated. And the more rules that they have in place to protect themselves, like the PSR, and we've seen recently even what Chelsea have done, sold the women's team. They're selling a hotel to balance what, if you're allowed to do that, it's all they're trying to do is find loopholes to make sure that they're above what the rules are. And nobody seems to be at the moment. And it's again what Kieran said, because the Premier League clubs are split and the smaller clubs are getting more and more disadvantaged. All that you're seeing, and the danger is from a fan's point of view, we're not going to see a Leicester City anymore. We are going to see the big 6, maybe 7 clubs breaking through, and that'll just create this 8, 7, 6, 7 clubs always up there in the Premier League qualifying for Champions League. Yes, you'll get one team coming out, but in the reality is they don't maintain it. The following season haven't got a big enough squad. Playing in Europe, the following season, they don't seem to have a good season the following season in the Premier League. So all of this just creates one thing. Americans are dominating the Premier League. They don't want to see relegation. They want to look after their assets, and they'll find every rule to make sure that the Premier League has protected themselves.
So a thumbs up there from Kieran. He heartily approves. Jack, how difficult is it from a journalist perspective to digest this information and then share it with a football audience? Because two things are possibly true. One is that the nuances of this are really complicated, and maybe the appetite of football fans to learn those nuances isn't that high. And secondly, some of it's all a bit sort of cloak and dagger and a bit hidden, and people will still talk about financial fair play in a way that isn't necessarily accurate. I mean, we learn that every week from Kieran. So what do you think the role of journalists is when it comes to information like this?
Well, I think first things first is listening to people like Kieran. They start off with. There are people who can explain it in a way that's granular, but also football fans can understand, essentially, because when you go through, when the Premier League release a big statement and it's 3,000 words long, chances are football fans are never in a million years going to read anything like that. They want the liner notes. They want how it's going to affect my club. And the answer, is this good for my club or is it bad for my club? And that's all they care about. So it is. So from Mark's standpoint as a Newcastle fan, it's clear that this sort of thing is technically bad for that club because it's kind of setting limitations on how much they can spend and how much they can challenge the big six teams. Like you see, a lot of transfer talk over the summer was centered around how are Man United able to sign all these players despite being pretty bad? Why are Newcastle and Aston Villa struggling and having to sell players when they're actually quite good? And it's these sort of rules here that make that dynamic possible at all times. Man United are always going to be a big club. They're always under these guidelines going to be able to spend money and be able to sign players and pay big wages on players. That's just the way these rules are going to work. And if you're a Man United fan, these things don't really change anything. They're still good for them. And for a Newcastle fan, they're probably bad. Same for Aston Villa. Same for a team like Nottingham Forest and stuff. And I think what we're seeing more and more coming through is that, and Mark alluded to it as well, it's when a team gets into the Champions League, that's when you're able to make way more money. So you have the opportunity and invest in players. But then what happens when you don't get into Europe next season? What happens when you don't have that Champions League revenue? All your revenue step down because you're relying on that European money coming in, and you have all these players who are on big wages, you spent big money on, and then you're trying to track back to get to that 85% threshold, which has now been put in place. So a lot of variables, a lot of is it good, is it bad for certain football fans? Generally, top clubs, all good, happy days. I think especially for Chelsea fans, probably seeing the stuff around the safeguarding heritage of clubs and selling off assets and things, that's now seemingly been stopped. But I doubt Chelsea fans care because they've done it all already. So even for them, it's quite good for them too.
So what changes can we expect to see, Kieran, going forward when it comes to how, especially the top six clubs operate?
I think they will continue to be fine. What I think we will see is perhaps a repeat of the summer of 2024, when we had six clubs. I don't know if people recall, but we had Forest, Villa, Chelsea, Newcastle, Everton and Leicester, and they were all in danger of breaching the rules. So if you get close to the end of the season, because player sales are included in the calculations, you might be incentivized to sell players just before the year end. So I think that's one thing. I think the other is that there will be more caution. These rules are very much a case of stay in your lane. So I think it's very frustrating for the ambitious or aspirational clubs such as Newcastle United, Nottingham Forest. I think you could argue Everton with their new owners and Aston Villa. All of these owners are spectacularly wealthy. Previously, they were able to put money into the club, and it did make a difference. Under these new rules, less so. That helps those clubs where the owners don't put in a penny. The Glazers certainly haven't at Manchester United. Liverpool have cautiously. At Spurs, it's been done with a great deal of reluctance. So I think we are operating in a new environment, and it is very much geared towards what's best for the bigger clubs. Mark mentioned earlier about another Leicester City. When Leicester City won the Premier League, the first thing that the big clubs did was that they changed the way that the money's distributed for TV purposes. Well, this is broadly an extension of that. And to those of us who are old enough to remember Derby County, Nottingham Forest, Everton, Blackburn Rovers, Leeds United, and so on, winning the old First Division or the start of the Premier League, those days, they're certainly not going to. I'm the oldest person here by a long, long way. It ain't going to happen in my lifetime, and I expect it might not happen in your lifetimes either.
Bleak thought. Do you think, Jack, is there any part of this that is good for football and for football fans, or do you think we're just seeing the sporting ethos corroded again and again and again?
If we find one positive in amongst it all is that teams like West Ham and things are just glad they have more clear guidelines on what's going to be expected of them moving forward. I think there was clear issues with PSR and what was expected and how to go about it and how to and stay within those thresholds. So it seems like now there's a more obvious number there to hit, and they can work around that number year to year, so they can. So that's a slight positive. Otherwise, I think there is clearly, as we've discussed, a lot of negatives around this. And look, a lot of it comes down to the pressures of regulatory committees and the lower down clubs, trying to put pressure on the top clubs to try and actually make positive changes to make sure that there is a competitive balance in the league. I think it's been weird that all this pressure has been put on, and what's ended up happening and what's come out of it is an even worse situation where it seems like they're even more safeguarded than they were before, whereas you would expect that through all these conversations, through all this pressure from regulatory committees and all these other clubs, that there would be changes for the positive. But all in all, it seems mostly negative. But if I could find one small positive, the guidelines seem a bit more clear than they were this time last year.
With that in mind, Mark, you've been up close with football clubs when new regulations and new rules are put in. Usually, are they taken well, or do you expect to see a bit of chaos and a few clubs falling down?
It's only well if it goes in your favour. That's for sure. So I'm sure, for example, Nottingham Forest will have frustrations because they want to develop, they want to grow as a football club, and we all know why the PSR rules were brought in. But I think now the clubs now have a lot of stability. I think a lot of the owners now do have stability. I think when you get an owner coming in, for example, like Nottingham Forest, Mr. Marinakis wants to invest in the club. He wants the club to do well. Why shouldn't he be allowed? The fans will be frustrated because you want to grow your club. You want to compete against the big six. But it seems like there's going to be very limited chances. So are we going to create these different leagues again where we have the top sides, the middle tier, and the bottom tier, which we've had, we're starting to see develop? Because one thing about the Premier League, which we all love and we've all loved, and we can't lose that competitiveness, is where, and we saw it at the weekend, where Nottingham Forest went to Liverpool and beat Liverpool. That's what makes the Premier League the product it is. Why people spend a lot of money on the overseas market on TV rights, because they love the drama of the Premier League. You want to see your bottom team be competitive against your big sides. And if you lose that competitiveness, you're going to lose a lot of people that love football because we as English still love that FA Cup drama, don't we? We like the small teams beating the big teams. And if you lose that drama, which the Premier League is at risk of doing with these changes, we're going to lose what the core and the heart of the Premier League was all about. And it would be sad because, we want to see, really good football. And I would be sad to see it leave.
Kieran, to build on that, I mean, Mark told us earlier that the Premier League clubs are the Premier League and they vote on the league, so they make the decisions. But this is a really good point. At what point do they start damaging the credibility of the league? It's so strong, and that's why they're making so much money, right? Because of the brand appeal of the league and the size of it globally. But if they create this system in which just the top six have their own league and then everyone else is just sort of fighting it out below, the product is much, much worse, isn't it?
The product is much worse, but as far as a global audience is concerned, do they actually care? Because they want to see Manchester United win, they want to see Liverpool win, they want to see Chelsea win. I'm a football romantic. I'm the same as Mark. I thought it was good for football to have, and it pains me to say, to have Crystal Palace win the FA Cup last season, to have Crystal Palace win the Community Shield, to have Nottingham Forest to win at Anfield. Because if you look at it from an economics point of view, the reason why the Premier League is successful is actually down to three factors. First of all, the overall quality of the product is there. Now, there's a danger of if I'm one of those middle class clubs, and I know the clubs coming up, that they're not going to catch us up, we're not going to challenge the big six, that's going to reduce their level of investment. So I think you've got a quality issue. You've got the jeopardy issue. Why do we go to football in the first place? Because I could watch it on television, but you want to be able to say that I was there when Forest won 3-0 at Anfield. I was there for that. Think about all those Scotland football fans who were at Hampden Park last Monday with what was one of the greatest and most enjoyable football matches I've seen in many a year. And also, then the third issue is connection. And football clubs have this unique ability to connect to fans, and that builds value and that builds interest. And that's why the Premier League is such a success, because it went out in 1992. It went to Mumbai, it went to Melbourne, it went to Mombasa. and it gave away its product, and it generated this global connection, which is the envy of every other big league. When I talk to people at La Liga, they say, "Yeah, we were a bit cocky in the early 90s. We just thought people would watch us automatically." The Premier League got it right, and it's reaping that reward ever since. I think there is a danger that if it becomes predictable, if that jeopardy diminishes, and I'm not being critical of Scottish football, but you know what's going to happen in Scottish football. Yes, Hearts have kept people interested for a couple of months, but they've had a couple of bad results. And there's no value in that because it becomes predictable. And if you take away the jeopardy element, you take away the quality, then I think you'll lose the connection and the value could diminish.
So, Jack, what comes next? We know there will be a next. There's always a next. This was the next. Now we have a new next. What is it?
Yeah, well, I think it's fully expected that the government is slowly starting to get more involved in what football regulation looks like. I actually spotted on Kieran's Twitter quite recently that there's like 1 million jobs going in the regulatory committee, so they are clearly bulking up in that regard too. So they are, and look, that's the next step, and I think all the Premier League clubs are very much aware of this. So go back to when Daniel Levy did that podcast with Gary Neville. And he was talking about, well, he obviously disagreed with the potential regulatory committee getting involved in football, but they were all very aware at that time that it's coming. If you go on gov.uk, you can find plenty about football on there right now, so you can. And I think what the Premier League, it seems to me anyways, and I'm sure Kieran will have a better insight than I will on this, it seems that the clubs are trying to get a bit of a step ahead of the government in terms of what they want, so that then they can go, well, we're doing this already, we don't need you guys. Case in point being this safeguarding heritage is what it's described as by the government, and it's about selling those assets, the stadiums, the women's teams, the training facilities, all that stuff. That is on the government's website, so it is. And the case example of that being the wrong thing you do is the 2021 Derby County situation, where they attributed some of that issues to the fact they sold the stadium to the club owner, so they did at that time. So that is a clear thing that the government has acknowledged as being a big issue in football, and through this SCR changes, the Premier League have clearly gone, okay, they think this is something that's wrong. This is something that we can change that won't actually make that big of a difference long term for us in terms of how we can maneuver financially. So there is very much a case of cat and mouse. I think the government's very clearly trying to get involved. The Premier League's trying to rush ahead of them to get to a point where they can go, look, we don't need anyone else coming in and telling us what we can do. We're doing it already. We're trying to regulate ourselves as best we can. The issue then comes to point is, where does it stop with the Premier League, and how far can they actually push regulation of themselves? We've seen with the salary cap situation, that was vehemently voted down by the Premier League clubs and by the PFA as well. I'm sure they would have got involved in that. And that's something there that, does the government get to a point where they think it's absolutely essential that is needed and necessary? And what does the Premier League do with that in mind afterwards?
Stuff for us all to think about. Thank you very much. Mark, thank you. Kieran, thank you. Jack, thank you. We'd love to know your thoughts if you're watching this. If you're watching on YouTube, get in the comments below. How do you feel about what's happening with the Premier League? What would you like to see happen next? What are your fears? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? Doesn't have to be football related. We're just nosy. So get it in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed to Beyond the Back Four, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the latest Beyond the Back Four podcast, available on YouTube and all podcast platforms. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single episode.